Good evening. This is Victor Graves. And whether you meant to find us or not, you have tuned your receiver to the lost signal. Some letters arrive with the manners of ordinary life. Bills folded by machines. Advertisements promising better sleep, whiter shirts, easier living. Invitations to weddings, funerals, anniversaries, and all the small ceremonies by which we pretend time is orderly. The envelope before me tonight did not belong to that world. It was plain, cream-colored, and sealed with a careful hand. There was no return address, no town, no state. Only my name written across the front in a narrow, disciplined script. Victor Graves. Inside were 3 letters, folded separately and numbered. The paper was thin and worn at the creases, as if the writer had opened and closed them many times before finding the courage to send them. They smelled faintly of candle smoke, old wood, dust, and beneath it all, something metallic, like a wire that had overheated behind a wall. The final page was signed, Father James O'Connor. Father O'Connor was not a famous man. No newspaper made a celebrity of him. No publisher collected his sermons. No photographer captured him standing outside a church while reporters asked what the devil looked like. He was an Irish Catholic priest, born in County Cork, brought to America as a boy, and ordained into a life of poor parishes, sick rooms, factories, prisons, and houses where grief had been given a permanent chair at the kitchen table. But there is a kind of fame that travels without print. There are names spoken quietly between rectories, names known to policemen who have written false reports because the truth would have made them look insane, names remembered by nurses who will not enter certain hospital rooms alone after midnight. Father James O'Connor was one of those names. For more than 40 years, he answered calls no man should be asked to answer. At the top of the first letter, he wrote, Victor, I am not sending you these pages because I want an audience. I am sending them because I have carried them too long, and I have mistaken silence for discipline. A priest is trained to keep secrets. That is holy work when the secret belongs to a soul. But some secrets are not kept. They are fed. I have fed these by silence. I will not die with them still eating. So we begin. The first letter is dated October 3rd, 1947. Dear Victor, you do not know me, though I believe I know something of you. I have listened to your program on nights when sleep would not come, and old rooms in my memory began opening themselves. You have a quality rare in men who speak into microphones. You do not seem hungry for horror. That matters more than you may understand. There are men who smile while opening a coffin. You are not one of them. That is why I have chosen you. I do not need a showman. I need a witness. Before I write of the first case, I should tell you plainly that most things called possession are not possession. They are grief, sickness, cruelty, drink, guilt, exhaustion, loneliness, or some family sorrow that has learned to speak in a frightening voice. Many times my work was not exorcism. It was mercy. It was telling frightened parents to call a doctor. It was sitting beside a widow until dawn because the dead husband she feared was not in the room, only in her heart. And that was terrible enough. But there are cases when the air has intention. There are rooms that listen. There are things that answer before the question has been asked. My first true case came in 1912, 6 miles outside a small American town called Mill Creek. I will not name the state. There may still be families there who remember the Harlan farm, and I have no wish to make their grandchildren curious. Curiosity is not harmless. I learned that late. Walter Harlan was a farmer, broad across the shoulders, quiet in the way of men who have lived too long with weather and debt. His wife, Helen, had died that spring after an illness of the lungs. Their daughter, Clara, was 19. She was known in the parish as a gentle girl, good with needlework, shy in company, and possessed of a thin, pretty singing voice. After her mother died, she stopped singing. When I reached the farmhouse, every window was open. It was December. Snow lay on the fields and along the porch rail, and the curtains inside snapped in the wind. Walter Harlan waited outside in shirt sleeves, his hands wrapped in flour sacks soaked through with blood. He had burned himself trying to carry his daughter from her room. He said, "Father, she is cold as pond ice, but she burns what touches her." I wanted him to be mad. There is my first confession. I wanted madness because madness has names in books. Madness has doctors, hospitals, sedatives, cruel procedures, and all the ugly machinery men have built to manage the broken mind. But what waited in that farmhouse had no interest in being explained by a doctor. I went inside with Father Thomas Riley, an older priest from the next parish. Riley was a good man, but brittle, a man of rules, a man who believed evil would present itself in forms approved by theology. The house was full of flies. In December, Victor. They covered the windows, the stair rail, the picture frames, the little framed Sacred Heart in the hall. Hundreds of them, perhaps more. But not one buzzed. They moved silently, all in the same direction, toward the stairs. Walter would not go up. He stood at the bottom, shaking so badly the banister knocked against his hip. Families look at priests strangely in such moments. They beg you to help them, and they hate you for being necessary. Clara's room was at the end of the upper hall. The door was shut. From inside came the sound of a woman humming. Walter made a sound behind me. Not a sob, something smaller and worse. "It's Helen," he whispered. Father Riley told him to stay back, and then we opened the door. Clara Harlan sat in a wooden chair in the center of the room. Her wrists were tied to the arms and her ankles to the legs. But Walter had padded the ropes with strips torn from bed sheets. I noticed that. I still notice it. Even in terror, he had tried not to hurt her. The bed was upside down. The washstand was upside down. The crucifix on the wall was upside down. The sampler above the dresser, stitched by Clara herself, read, "Bless this house." And it, too, had been turned upside down. Only the chair remained upright. It hovered several inches above the floorboards. Clara lifted her head. Her face was pale, her lips cracked, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked exhausted. Human. That made it worse. Then she spoke in her dead mother's voice. "Walter," she said, "you were relieved when I died." Her father collapsed in the hallway. There are accusations that are lies, and there are accusations that are worse because they are nearly true. Walter had loved his wife. I believe that. I also believe there had been nights near the end when he had prayed in some dark cellar of his heart for the coughing to stop by any means God would allow. The thing in Clara knew it. Father Riley opened his book and began the prayers. Clara smiled at him, not with fury, not with cruelty, with pity, which was worse. "The old one has paper," she said. "The young one has pride." The flies rose from every surface in the room. They did not swarm wildly. They gathered above Clara in a slow, turning column, black and silent, as if smoke had learned discipline. Then, without warning, they struck Father Riley in the face. They went for his eyes. He screamed and staggered backward into the hall, clawing at himself, the book falling from his hands. I heard him hit the wall. I heard Walter crying. I heard the flies crawling over cloth, skin, hair. I was alone in the room. No, that is not true. I was alone with what was using Clara. Downstairs, a chair scraped across the kitchen floor. Walter cried out his wife's name. A kettle began to whistle on a cold stove. Clara's chair turned slowly in the air until she faced me. Her bare feet hung above the boards. "You are not brave," it said. I continued the prayer. "You are angry," I continued. "You crossed an ocean and called it faith, but it was hunger. You wanted to become a man no one could abandon." That struck me harder than the flies. My father left before we sailed from Ireland. I was 6 years old. For years, I told people he had died because death sounded cleaner than desertion. A child can turn shame into a gravestone if he is lonely enough. The thing knew. It leaned forward in Clara's body and asked if I wanted to know where he had gone. I stopped praying for only a moment, but a moment is sometimes enough. The floorboards beneath me darkened with water. Not much. Thin black lines rising through the cracks. The smell of Boston Harbor filled the room. Salt, coal smoke, fish rot, sickness, hope. I was 6 again. My mother's hand was tight around mine. My father was not there. Clara whispered, "He lived 20 more years." I wanted to ask where. I wanted to ask if he had ever spoken of us. I wanted to ask if he regretted me. Instead, by a mercy I did not deserve, I said Clara's name. Clara Harlan. The chair dropped slightly. I said it again with more than her name. I spoke of her father and mother, of St. Anne's where she had been baptized, of her singing, of the crooked blue bird she stitched into cloth, of the small human particulars no demon can love because it cannot understand why they matter. Her mouth opened too wide. From the hallway, Walter cried, "Don't hurt her!" That nearly undid me, because true exorcism hurts the person you are trying to save. Do not let any romantic fool tell you otherwise. You stand beside a soul caught in a trap, and to pull it free, you must pull through wounds. Clara began to cry. Not the thing. Clara. Her voice came from far away, inside herself. "Please, Father, I'm tired." And I nearly stopped. That is my second confession. I nearly mistook my weakness for mercy. The thing smiled through her tears. "Good priest," it whispered. "Kind priest." Then the flies struck the walls. They were not flying now. They were throwing themselves. Their bodies burst against the wallpaper with soft, wet taps, hundreds of them, while Father Riley sobbed in the hallway and Walter prayed in a voice that had lost all rhythm. I looked at the wall and saw that the dead flies had gathered thickest around the family photographs. Walter's face was hidden. Clara's face was hidden. Only Helen remained untouched, smiling in her wedding dress as if the room had spared her on purpose. I asked the thing its name. The room went still. Even the kettle downstairs fell silent. I will not write the name here. Do not ask me to. If these letters are read aloud, do not pause here for effect. Do not give the silence too much shape. Some names behave like keys, even in unbelieving mouths. When the thing whispered its name, Clara's body arched back so violently I thought her spine would break. The ropes smoked, the wallpaper blistered, the crucifix twisted on its nail. I spoke what had been given to me, not as a magic word, not as theater, but as a command. The windows slammed shut, the flies fell dead, the chair dropped, and Clara struck the floor with a cry that was finally her own. Then the room was only a room. The bed was a bed. The ceiling was a ceiling. Father Riley was bleeding in the hall. Walter was on his knees. Snow tapped against the window. For a little while, I believed we had won. Then Clara began to laugh. It was not loud. It was small and broken. The laugh of someone who has seen too much to return fully to the world. She looked at me and said, "It showed me your father." I could not speak. She said, "He had your eyes." Victor, I have carried that sentence for 35 years. Clara lived. She married a schoolteacher and moved west. She wrote to me once a year until 1941. Her letters were kind, too kind. She never mentioned that night. Walter Holland died before spring. The death was called an accident, a rope in the barn, a broken beam. Men will do much to spare a family shame. Father Riley left active ministry within the year. The last time I saw him, he sold religious books from a little shop in Baltimore. He would not shake my hand. He said, "James, we did not cast it out. We only taught it what frightened us." I thought he was a broken man speaking nonsense. I do not think that anymore. That was the end of the first letter. There was a second sheet tucked behind it, written in a shakier hand. It said, "Victor, if your listeners expect clean victories, warn them away from me. I never saw one. Grace is real, but it is not tidy. Sometimes the room is saved and the house is not. Sometimes the child lives and the father does not. Sometimes the priest walks away and leaves part of himself kneeling on the floor." The second letter is dated October 4th, 1947. Dear Victor, you will notice I have stopped writing Mr. Graves. Forgive the familiarity. An old Irish priest should know better than to presume friendship with a voice on the radio. But confession makes companions of strangers. You have my worst memories in your hands now, and that is a kind of introduction. I told you of Clara Holland because she was the first. I tell you now of George Whitman because he was the case that taught me evil does not always enter a man through hatred. Sometimes it enters through pain. This was 1926, in a Pennsylvania mill town I will call Briarfield. That is not its name. The war had been over for years, though anyone who says a war ends when papers are signed has never listened to a veteran sleep. George Whitman had returned from France with one damaged lung, a limp that worsened in damp weather, and a silence in him that no one could cross. His wife Evelyn came to me after morning mass. She was not old, but worry had made her face severe. She wore a black coat buttoned to the throat and gloves she did not remove, though the church was warm. She said, "Father, my husband hears things." I asked what sort of things. She said, "Everything." That was how she put it, everything. The kitchen tap, the clock above the stove, the butcher's wagon in the street, rain in the gutters, the factory whistle, a fork against a plate, a child's marble rolling under a chair. Everything had become the war. At first I thought of shell shock. Any decent man would have. I had seen enough returned soldiers by then to know that a battlefield does not release all its prisoners at once. Some men came home with France still happening behind their eyes. Evelyn told me George could no longer eat meat. He said beef smelled as if it had lain for days in the sun. Chicken soup made him retch if there was a bone in it. Pork from the butcher, wrapped cleanly in paper and tied with string, sent him to the yard on his knees. When the kitchen tap dripped, he would freeze and then duck beneath the table with both hands over his head. He smashed every clock in the house because the ticking was not ticking to him. It was a machine gun finding its rhythm. He packed mud into the cracks beneath the cellar door, and when Evelyn asked why, he told her it was to keep the gas from crawling upstairs while they slept. Then he began sleeping in the cellar. That was when she came to me. I went first not as an exorcist, but as a priest. There is a difference. A priest enters with compassion. An exorcist enters with suspicion. I did not yet know which George needed, and I was afraid of choosing wrongly. I found him at the kitchen table cutting an apple. His hands trembled. His hair had gone gray at the temples, though he was not yet 40. He sliced the apple carefully and arranged the pieces around the plate, as if order itself might protect him. Evelyn stood near the stove, watching him the way one watches a candle in a draft. When she told him I was there, he looked up at me with eyes tired beyond sleep and asked if I heard it too. The house was quiet, except for the tap. A drop fell into the sink. George flinched. "Rifle," he whispered. I told him it was only water. He gave me a sad little smile, almost kindly, as if I were the one who did not understand danger. "That's how it starts," he said. Another drop fell, and he named it again. Another, and again. Then the clock above the stove began ticking, though Evelyn swore she had stopped it days before. George's breathing changed. He was not fully in the kitchen anymore. His shoulders tightened, his mouth drew back, and he looked past me toward some field only he could see. He told someone to keep low. No one answered. He said it again, pleading now, and then he screamed at someone invisible not to stand. A wagon rolled over loose stones in the street outside. George threw himself to the floor so hard the chair toppled behind him. He crawled beneath the table, dragging one leg, clawing at the boards until his fingers bled. When I knelt beside him and asked whom he was searching for, he said, the boy asking for water." That still did not prove possession. Remember that, Victor. Pain can make ghosts without the devil's help. I told Evelyn he needed a doctor. She nodded, but there was no relief in her face. She had tried doctors. She had tried tonics, powders, rest, prayer, kindness, sternness, and silence. She had tried loving him quietly enough that he might not notice how afraid she was. The change came slowly enough that I nearly missed it. A man ruined by war may mistake a sound for gunfire. George began reacting before the sound occurred. The tap would gather itself in silence, and before the drop fell, he would cover his head. The clock would pause, and before the next tick came, he would whisper for us to keep low. Once, a plate on the shelf cracked cleanly in half after George had already flinched from the shot it had not yet made. It was then that George looked directly at me, and something behind his expression amused itself. "The Irish priest thinks this is memory," he said. The voice was George's. The intelligence was not. He began to hum. It was low and patient, not quite a tune, more a pattern than a melody. The tap entered it. The clock entered it. The cracked plate trembled softly against the shelf. Every small sound in that kitchen found the same rhythm, and the room became orderly in a way that was more frightening than noise. The demon had not made thunder. It had made music from ordinary things. Shell shot makes a man hear the war in ordinary sounds. This was different. The ordinary sounds had begun speaking war back to him. I had heard of such a thing only once, from an old Benedictine who had spent too much of his life reading books no sane man should read alone. He wrote of a spirit that entered through rhythm, that broke men not by showing them horrors, but by teaching the world to repeat them. Amdusius. I did not say the name aloud then. Names are not labels, Victor. They are doors. George smiled wider. So he does know me, he said. Evelyn asked what was happening. I told her to leave the room. She refused, and I do not blame her. Love is not always wise, but it is loyal. George rose suddenly and went to the sink. He turned the tap on full. Water hammered into the basin, and he screamed, not in fear, but in recognition. He plunged both hands into the water and tried to scoop it up, but he could not seem to hold any. He begged someone to drink. There was no boy in the room, but George saw him. Amdusius had found the wound. Later, piece by piece, I learned what had happened in France. George had been moving through a ruined trench after shelling. Smoke lay low to the ground. Rain fell hard enough to turn the earth into something that wanted to swallow men. Somewhere ahead, a boy was calling for water. George thought the boy was German, perhaps 16, perhaps younger. The trench wall had collapsed over him, and only part of his face and one arm were free. George had water left, not much, enough. He told himself the boy was already dying. He told himself stopping would mean his own death. He told himself many things. Then he stepped over him. The boy was still calling when the next shell fell. That was the memory Amdusius had chosen, not because it was George's only sin, but because it was the one he could not forgive. After that, the case became a siege, not of the house, of George. For nearly a week, the demon changed the world around him by inches. A kettle whistled, and George heard incoming shells. Coal smoke from the furnace became gas. Bed sheets became bandages. Rain became marching. A knife against a cutting board became steel entering ribs. A child outside bounced a rubber ball against the pavement, and George began counting the seconds between artillery strikes. He stopped sleeping, and then he stopped knowing when he was awake. On the 7th night, he tore up the kitchen floor with a fireplace poker. Evelyn found him on his knees, bleeding from both hands, whispering that the boy was under the boards and that he could still hear him. That was when I returned with Father Paul Brennan and Mr. Mercer. We took George to the cellar because he would not remain upstairs. He said the ceiling was too high. He said the sky could see him through it. The cellar was low, dirt-floored, and cold. Evelyn's preserves stood in neat rows along the shelves, though every label had been turned toward the wall. George had done that. Names draw fire, he said. We sat him in a chair. At first, he seemed calm, which frightened me more than the screaming. Father Brennan stood to my left. Mr. Mercer held the lantern near the stairs. Evelyn remained above us in the kitchen, though I begged her to go to a neighbor. The first sound was the tap upstairs. George's eyes opened. The drop fell again, and his fingers tightened around the arms of the chair. I watched his body receive the sound before the rest of us understood it. His shoulders hunched, his jaw locked. Sweat ran down his face. "Please," he whispered, "not tonight." I began the prayers quietly. The lantern flame narrowed. The cellar took on the smell of rain, then mud, then meat left too long in the sun. Mr. Mercer gagged and covered his nose. Father Brennan stopped praying and looked at me, and I knew from his face that he smelled it too. George laughed under his breath. There was no joy in it, no madness either, only exhaustion. He found you, too, he said. Amdusius did not speak from George's mouth at first. It used the rhythm, the tap upstairs, the settling beams, the lantern glass clicking as it warmed, a loose pipe somewhere in the wall. Each sound entered the pattern until the cellar seemed to be thinking in beats. Then George's mouth opened, and a boy's voice came out of him, dry and torn and half-choked with mud. He asked for water. Evelyn cried out from the stairs. George answered himself, insisting he had none. The boy answered that he did. The exchange might have seemed almost simple if it had not been happening through one throat. George clapped his hands over his ears, but the cough came from inside him. His chest jerked with it. His throat worked. Mud-colored water ran from his mouth onto his shirt. I said the demon's name. The cellar went silent. The tap, the clock, the beams, the rain, even the breath in our throats seemed to pause. George looked at me with eyes that were suddenly not tired at all. There, Amdusius said. Now we are introduced. That was the enemy, Victor. Not grief, not memory, not war. A thing ancient enough to know that a man's worst moment can be played like an instrument if one has patience. George's body began to tremble in the chair, not randomly, but in rhythm. His teeth clicked together. His fingers tapped the chair arms. His heels struck the dirt floor. Then he began screaming. The neighbors heard him. That part is in the police report. They heard screaming from the Whitman house for nearly an hour and said afterward that it did not sound like one man. They heard men begging for water, men calling for mothers, men praying, men cursing, men laughing because they had passed beyond fear. The house was not speaking to them. George's throat had become a battlefield, and Amdusius was forcing him to contain it. That was the torture. At one point, George saw Evelyn on the stairs, or seemed to see her. For a moment, his face softened. Then Amdusius changed her in his mind. George recoiled in terror and begged the nurses not to waste morphine on him. Evelyn came down a step and said his name. I told her to stay back. She did not. When she said it was her, George answered in her voice, then in the boy's voice, then in his own, as if the demon were trying on every possible meaning of the word me. Evelyn stopped. That saved her. Had she touched him then, I believe he would have struck her, perhaps killed her. Not from hatred, from terror. Amdusius had made love unrecognizable to him. It did not merely want George mad. It wanted him damned. It wanted him to destroy the one proof that he had ever come home. I moved between them. The laugh that came through George had rhythm. Everything about Amdusius had rhythm. It broke men by repetition. Drip, tick, march, shot, scream, memory. All arranged until the mind began to obey the pattern. I prayed louder, though I no longer remember the exact words. The demon began to count through George's mouth, slowly enough that each number seemed to push him deeper into the chair. When it reached the moment in his memory where he had stepped over the boy, George's face collapsed. The cellar did not become a battlefield, not fully. That would have been easier to dismiss afterward as a vision or a madness shared by frightened men. What happened was more intimate. The floor beneath our shoes grew damp. The lantern light thinned to the color of smoke. Father Brennan began coughing. Mr. Mercer stared at his hands and whispered that the blood was not his, though I saw no blood on him. The demon had widened George's wound enough for the rest of us to feel its edges. For one clean second, George looked at me and was present. Father, he said, make it stop. I told him to listen to my voice. Amdusias answered that George had listened before. Then the boy asked for water again. George wept and said, "I had some." The rhythm stopped. That was the first true silence of the night. Confession had interrupted the music. I saw then how the demon had held him, not by convincing George he was innocent, but by convincing him that if he spoke the truth, he would cease to be human. So I told him the truth before the demon could use it. I told him he had water. I told him he heard the boy. I told him he stepped over him. Evelyn made a sound on the stairs, but I continued because the wound had to be opened cleanly or it would never drain. Then I told him he was not only that moment. Amdusias tried to bring the rhythm back, the tap, the clock, the rain. I spoke over it. I said George's name, and more than his name. I spoke of Evelyn, of his parents, of baptism, of the factory where he made wire, of the foolish songs he sang before the war, of the peppermints he gave neighborhood children because he could not pass a child without offering sweetness. I gave him back to himself, piece by piece. Amdusias laughed and called names little tags for frightened animals. I told George to speak. That was something I had not done with Clara Harlan. With Clara, I had spoken for her. With George, I understood that he had to return by his own mouth. He said his name. The demon made the tap sound like gunfire, and he flinched, but said it again. The cellar filled with the smell of rot, and he said it again. The boy whispered for water, and George closed his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. Not to me, not to Evelyn, to the boy. He said he had heard him. He said he had water. He said he stepped over him and had heard him every day since. The cellar did not shake. No window shattered. No flame changed color. Nothing theatrical happened. And that was how I knew the wound had opened in the right place. George said, "I was afraid." Amdusias screamed then, because fear confessed is no longer as useful as fear hidden. George sobbed that he had been afraid and left the boy there. The rhythm broke. The tap became water again. The clock became a clock. The rain became rain. For a moment, I thought it was finished. Then Amdusias made its final attempt. It spoke in Evelyn's voice from George's mouth and said, "You came home without him." George opened his eyes. Evelyn came down the stairs and knelt in the dirt before him. This time I did not stop her. She took his face in her hands and told him he had come home. He shook his head, but she held him there. She said he had come home broken, but he had come home, and she was still there. George looked at her then, really looked. The cellar was quiet except for the rain and the ordinary merciful dripping of the tap upstairs. He said, "Tell Evelyn I did come home." She was right in front of him, Victor. That is what broke my heart. He was looking at her, and still he asked me to tell her, because some part of him remained so far away he did not trust that she could hear him. Evelyn pressed her forehead to his and said she knew. That was when George began to pray. Softly, badly. He forgot half the words. It was the most beautiful prayer I have ever heard. Amdusias left him near dawn, not with thunder or smoke, but with a sound like a violin string snapping in another room. George lived 3 weeks. Do not call that failure. Some victories do not give a man his life back. They give him his death back. There is mercy in that, though it tastes of ashes. On his last morning, Evelyn cut him an apple. He arranged the slices on his blanket and asked her to open the window. She did, and rain moved softly in the street outside. "It sounds like rain," he said. Evelyn began to cry. He smiled. "Only rain," he said. Then he slept. After he died, Evelyn sold the house. The new owners lasted 11 days. They did not complain of ghosts. They did not hear marching. They did not see soldiers. They complained only of the kitchen tap. No plumber could stop it from dripping, always in the same rhythm. That was the end of the second letter. There are pages, dear listeners, that seem to grow heavier as one reads them. Father O'Connor's second letter had that quality. It did not merely describe fear. It carried the shame of survival. Not George's alone, the priest's as well. I will confess something of my own. I paused before opening the third. Not long, long enough. The envelope had grown cold in my hand. The third letter is dated October 5th, 1947. At the top, before the greeting, Father O'Connor had written one sentence in red ink. "Victor, read this only if you are willing to be heard." The letter begins. "Dear Victor, I have written this final letter more times than I care to admit. I burned one version. I tore another into pieces and flushed it down a rectory toilet like a fightin' schoolboy. I carried a sealed copy in my coat for over a week and told myself I was waiting for conviction. That was a lie. I was waiting for cowardice to become wisdom. This is the copy I have chosen to send. My hand hurts as I write. The old burn across my palm is opened again. Not bleeding, worse, warm, as if someone has pressed a mouth there and begun to breathe. I tell you this not for drama. I am past drama. I tell you because I want one person to understand what it costs me to write the truth. You may think, after what I have told you of Clara Harlan and George Whitman, that I knew the shape of evil by 1938. I did not. I knew only some of its habits. The case began with a telephone call from a doctor named Arthur Price. He was not Catholic, not even a believer as far as I could tell. He was a rational man, and I do not use that word as an insult. Rational men are often brave in useful ways. They wash wounds, set bones, and do not faint at blood. They trust what can be measured. But when the unmeasurable comes, they are sometimes the first to shatter. Dr. Price said his wife, Eleanor, had been ill for 2 months. Not physically, he insisted. Her pulse was steady, her appetite normal. No fever, no wasting. She slept well, spoke clearly, and recognized everyone. Then his voice failed him. "She has stopped casting a shadow," he said. I nearly hung up. You may judge me for that. I judge myself. By then I had received too many calls from hysterics, drunkards, frauds, and lonely people who needed attention more than deliverance. I thought this was one more. Then he sent a photograph. Eleanor Price stood in a garden at noon. Behind her, the shadows of the house, the fence, the rose bushes, the photographer, and even a garden spade were sharp on the grass. Eleanor had none. I went that afternoon. The Price house stood outside a quarry town in New England. White stone, broad windows. A clean, modern house of the kind men build when they believe light can disinfect sorrow. Dr. Price met me at the door. He had not slept. His collar was crooked. One side of his face twitched every few seconds. Before I could introduce myself, he told me he did not believe in what I did. I said belief was not required. He laughed once, and I have rarely heard a worse sound from a living man. He led me to the sitting room. Eleanor Price sat at a piano with her hands folded in her lap. She was perhaps 35, beautiful in a spare, composed way. Dark hair, long fingers. A face like a portrait someone had forgotten to finish. Afternoon sun poured through the windows. She had no shadow. Victor, I have seen a girl rise from a chair. I have heard flies go silent in December. I have seen a man tortured by a rhythm only hell could keep. But Eleanor Price, sitting calmly in sunlight without a shadow, frightened me more than all of them. A shadow is such a modest companion. We drag it everywhere and never thank it. We step over it, distort it, lose it at noon, regain it at evening. But when it is gone, the soul notices. Eleanor turned to me. "Father James O'Connor," she said, "the Irish one." I asked if we had met. "No," she said, "but you are discussed." Dr. Price whispered, "By whom?" Eleanor smiled. "The rooms he emptied." I felt recognition before fear. The Harlan farmhouse, the Whitman cellar. Other rooms I have not told you about and will not. Children, widows, prisoners, men tied to beds, women who spoke with voices their throats could not make, houses abandoned, reports softened, families comforted with half-truths. Something had been present in those places, not the same demon in different masks. That would almost have comforted me. This was something behind them, a watcher, a student. I asked what it wanted. Eleanor stood, and the piano began playing by itself. Not a hymn, not a funeral march. A child's exercise. 5 notes, simple and patient. She said, "When you speak a name, Father, do you believe the soul hears you first, or do we?" I began the rite. Eleanor listened politely. That was new. The possessed usually resist. They rage, mock, plead, spit, convulse, blaspheme, perform. They make a theater of power because they fear being named. Eleanor did not perform. She observed. For the first time in my life, I did not feel like a priest in battle. I felt like an insect pinned for study. Doors opened throughout the house with soft, courteous clicks. The kitchen, the cellar, the linen closet, a bedroom upstairs, the front door behind me. Eleanor asked how many times a door must open before it becomes a hallway. I continued. The piano slowed. From upstairs came Father Riley's voice. "We only taught it what frightened us." From the kitchen came George Whitman's voice. "Tell Evelyn I did come home." From the hall came Clara Harlan, weeping. More voices joined them. Every case, every name, every person I had failed to save, every official report I had softened because the truth would not have been believed, every bishop I had reassured, every doctor I had thanked, every family that slept because I had lied gently enough. Eleanor watched me. "A man is only a house with memory for wallpaper," she said. The walls began to darken. At first I thought clouds had covered the sun. Then I saw the wallpaper moving, faces pressed beneath it, hands, mouths, cheeks flattened under blue flowers. Dr. Price ran to his wife. I shouted for him to stop, but he had already reached her. He took her by the shoulders and called her Ellie. That was the little name, the name her mother had used. Eleanor kissed him on the forehead. His shadow detached from his feet. It peeled away from the floor like wet cloth and rose behind him, tall and black in the sunlight. Dr. Price did not see it. I did. The shadow placed its hands over his eyes, and he screamed with the sound of a man seeing everything his mind had protected him from. Every corpse he had opened, every patient he had failed, every contempt he had felt for prayer, every tenderness he had hidden because he thought tenderness made him weak. He fell to the carpet, begging to be blind. Eleanor looked at me. "Mouths are crude," she said. "Shadows are better." I wanted to run. Let that stand plainly. I wanted to leave Arthur Price on the floor. I wanted to leave Eleanor at the piano. I wanted to leave the house, the quarry, the town, the country, the whole suffering world. I wanted my mother's kitchen in Cork. I wanted to be 6 years old before I knew men leave, women die, and God's servants are sometimes asked to stand in rooms where God seems very far away. Instead, I stepped between Eleanor and the light. My shadow fell across her feet. For the first time, she reacted. She inhaled, not with pain exactly, but with surprise. My shadow touched her, and she disliked it. I stepped closer. The house groaned. The open doors slammed shut. The piano strings snapped one after another, each crack sharp as a rifle shot. Windows shattered inward. Dr. Price clawed at the carpet, blood running from his ears. I said Eleanor Price's name. The thing smiled. I said the name given to her at baptism. The smile thinned. Then I said the little name, Ellie. The thing screamed, not in rage, but in discovery. It had not known Victor. It had studied terror, guilt, bodies, rooms, shame, ritual, voice, and memory. It had learned the architecture of fear, but it did not understand love except as leverage. It knew the knife, but not the hand that drops it. It knew the locked door, but not the mother waiting on the other side. It knew confession, but not absolution. I said the little name again. Eleanor's shadow appeared, only for a moment. It lay behind her on the floor, thin and trembling, like a woman reaching up from under dark water. I reached for it. That was my mistake. The shadow took my hand. For a few seconds, I was not in the Price house. I was in a place with no walls and too many rooms. Bedrooms where children hid under blankets. Kitchens where husbands washed blood from their hands. Churches where men prayed without believing. Hospital wards, trenches, confessionals, hotel rooms, barn lofts, schoolhouses after dark. Every place where someone had whispered, "Please, God," and heard something else answer first. Every room was occupied, and moving among them was not a beast, not a man, not the horned figure from painted church glass. Attention, pure attention. It noticed me. I came back to myself on the floor. My right hand was burned black across the palm. Eleanor Price lay beside the piano, breathing. Dr. Price was curled beneath the window, blind and laughing like a child who had fallen from a great height and survived by mistake. The room had shadows again. Every chair, every table, every broken string of the piano. Eleanor, too. I believed it was over. You would think, after all I had seen, I would know better than to believe in clean endings. Eleanor woke 3 days later and remembered nothing after a morning in May when she had gone into the garden to cut roses. She lived quietly for 7 years. Dr. Price never recovered his sight or his reason. He spent the rest of his life asking people to stand between him and windows. As for me, I stopped accepting cases in 1941, not because I lost faith. That is the easy explanation, and people like easy explanations because they make fear digestible. I stopped because of what happened the night after the Price case. I was in my room at the rectory. My hand was bandaged. I had not slept. Rain tapped against the window. Near midnight, the little radio on my desk turned on by itself. Static filled the room. Then came the piano. The same patient exercise. A voice spoke through the static. It was not Eleanor Price, not Clara Harlan, not George Whitman. It was mine. My own voice, older than I was then, said, "We have learned the air." I tore the radio from the wall and threw it down the stairs. The next morning, it was back on my desk, unbroken. Victor, I have avoided radio since that night. I do not sit near telephones longer than necessary. I do not allow my sermons to be recorded. I do not speak into microphones. Laugh if you must. I have survived worse than laughter. But you understand, don't you? That is why I am writing to you and not speaking. I think it learned something from me. I think it learned that the human voice can enter a room without a body. I think it learned that fear travels beautifully through wire. And now I have done the one thing I swore never to do. I have given it a road to your microphone. You may hate me for that. Perhaps you should. But I am old, Victor. Old enough that my hands shake when I lift the chalice. Old enough that young priests speak gently to me in hallways. Old enough that people mistake my silence for peace. It is not peace. It is a door I have been holding shut with my back for 9 years. I am tired, so I give you the truth. Not because truth always saves, but because lies have certainly failed. If you read this aloud, do not make me brave. I was frightened every time. At Mill Creek, in the Whitman cellar, in the Price house. The only difference between me and the coward is that sometimes, by grace or stubbornness or shame, I remained frightened in the room. Should your studio grow cold, stop. Should you hear the piano, stop. Should your engineer speak with your voice, stop. And if something says your name from the dark beyond the glass, Victor, do not answer. Names matter. That is the one thing it still does not fully understand. A name is not merely a handle. It is a claim. Father James O'Connor. That was the end of the third letter. I have read Father O'Connor's words as faithfully as I am able. I have omitted only one thing, the name he refused to write in the first letter. You may think that omission theatrical. I assure you it is not. There are some doors a responsible man does not open for atmosphere. Now I would like to tell you the studio is warm. It is not. I would like to tell you there is a piano somewhere in the building. There is not. I would like to tell you that distinction comforts me. It does not. Because while I was reading Father O'Connor's final letter, while my eyes were on his warning, and our engineer sat beyond the glass with one hand near the switch, I heard something through my headphones. At first, I thought it was static. Then I thought it was breathing. Then I held my breath. The sound continued. Our engineer raised his eyes. He heard it too. The piano followed, soft and patient. Not from the studio, not from the hall, but from the headphones. Then the voice spoke. It was mine. Not as I sound now, older, nearer the grave. It said, "We have learned your name." Only that. Our engineer took off his headphones. I did not. I was afraid that if I moved too quickly, something would know I had heard it. There are stories that end with a scream. There are stories that end with a corpse discovered in the morning. This one ends with an old Irish priest's burned hand, 3 letters on my desk, and a sound moving through the wires as though the air itself has learned to listen. This is Victor Graves. You have been tuned to the lost signal. Do not touch that dial too quickly. Something else may have its hand there first.